Well, hello. My name is Zach Studenroth. I'm a historic preservation consultant and have a special interest in preserving and restoring historic burying grounds and cemeteries. And today we're at the old burying ground in Sag Harbor, New York, as you can see by the sign. There's been a great interest in the history and the preservation of this site beginning back in the 1990s. When a local historian named Dorothy Zykowski and a committee began to record the site, generated this map and a book with biographies of some of the more interesting and important individuals who were buried here. So the project that we're focusing on now is to restore the grave sites of the patriots and veterans who served in the American Revolution. It's a project that's been sponsored by the Southampton Colony chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution, who have matched funding with the Robert Gardner Foundation to do the restoration work and also to generate a walking tour and a learning plan for the local elementary school so that there will be a follow-up teaching opportunity here at the site after the stones have been restored, so that the students from the school, which is within walking distance, can come here to learn more about the Revolution. And the walking tour will be available through the Historical Society. So that, again, will be a lasting outcome of the project. This is the gravesite of Captain Lester Beebe. So our project here will be focusing on repairing the stones where they can be repaired. In this case, Beebe stone, we have not probed to see if there are any more pieces surviving. But if in fact we don't find any, we will treat him, but we have a replacement stone coming from the Veterans Administration that will identify him by name and his death dates. So we'll just take a moment out. We've been talking about the Revolutionary War patriots that are buried here. It's important to understand that the larger context. This was Sag Harbor's first burying ground, laid out in the 1760s. And the burials continue here through the Revolution and up until about 1850, by which time the larger cemetery, the public cemetery, now Oakland Cemetery, was opened across town because this was basically filling up. The fact that there is a church next door is coincidental. This is not a church burying ground or a churchyard. It was actually a public burying spot prior to the construction of the church, which takes place in 1844. In fact, when the church was built, they had to carve a piece of the property off to level the site for construction. And there's a large stone wall there today which separates these two properties. So very briefly, what we want to look at here is the function of the footstone. In some cases, you'll see the large headstone. You can see the width of it here. This would have stood about this high. As far as we can see, none of that remains. Luckily, however, it preserves the footstone, which is back here, broken, but on the ground. And so the relationship of the headstone to the footstone is that the body was interred, this was the gravesite, with the head toward the west and the foot marked by the footstone to the east. This is marked, oftentimes, if the stone is gone, you could still identify who the burial is because the stone is marked NF, which stands for Nathan Fordham. So we know that the stone was that of Nathan Fordham. Kurt is going to demonstrate the reason why the headstone and the footstone are oriented on a west to east axis. And if you look across this site, that's a uniform placement of the body. So Kurt, you want to demonstrate?
You will describe and I'll do it.
Yes, you do it. Kurt is going to demonstrate the orientation of the body here. Um, again, on a west to east axis, and notice typically these are about 6 feet apart. That was the size of the casket lowered into the ground. So this goes to the religious belief shared by everyone interred here that there would be a second coming on Judgment Day. And what you want to be able to do is to sit up and witness the miracle of the second coming of Christ, which is from the east with the sunrise. And so this orientation enables the deceased to participate in that miraculous Judgment Day.
So here I am, almost finished getting the biogrowth, lichen, moss, everything that grows on the somewhat porous brownstone headstones, using materials that are softer than the rock itself. Wooden picks are excellent for carefully revealing the inscriptions that get hidden underneath the lichen. Also revealing some condition issues like this vertical crack, which will be addressed after the stone is free of lichen. That would be an injection, which our conservator can explain in, more fully when he's doing the work. Plastic scrapers of a variety of sizes do not damage the stone. Sometimes the brownstones are so fragile that we don't even want to use this application, and sometimes it's better to leave the lichen there if it's completely deteriorated. But in this case, the inscription came out much sharper than it was before. And then with a variety of soft brushes, we remove all the residual dust and growth particles in all the parts of the stone, front and back. And now he's legible and ready for the next conservation treatment. So he's stabilized. And after that happens, we will dig a small trench around his headstone, and we will straighten it up to more or less match the row here. We won't move it, but it'll come up to about here once it's straightened. Now, this is an interesting part to talk about while we're talking about the straightening. So typically, any headstone is the entire length of the headstone as it was made. 2/3 of it is above ground, and 1/3 is below ground. That's the general proportion of how these were put into the earth. So we know that there's probably this much of this stone underground. What happens when they lean, they're not breaking the, let's say this is the headstone and this is the ground level. This headstone's going this way. The bottom third of the headstone is pushing the soil away from it this way. So when we straighten, you trench so that in the least intervention as possible to get the stone upright. It starts to loosen a bit. It's a very slow, careful, methodical process to slowly get the stone up so that the bottom 1/3 of it, where is it going? Goes back like this. So the entire stone moves. It's just interesting that there's so much underground. They rarely fall over on their own as if pop out of the ground and land flat. But as they age and lean, the likelihood of it breaking here increases because of the weight as it goes back. That's usually how they break. Also, if a headstone's leaning like this and one leans against it, it has a much higher likelihood of breaking than if it were upright because of the way the gravity is working on it. So, we're moving along with him. Here we have the headstone of Braddock Corey, brownstone, deteriorated for a few reasons, not just for age. This is a sedimentary rock, so it's composed of layers. When the headstone is cut out of the sedimentary rock, it often has the layers visible but intact. Over time, water gets in mostly through the top, it freezes, and it starts to separate the layers. And you can see that here on the edge. There are many layers that are coming off. Unfortunately, the most important layer, the inscription part, is gone. A lot of times, even though a stone might not look this deteriorated and need the stabilization treatment, if you take your finger and carefully tap on parts of it and it sounds hollow, then you know that there's airspace between the outer layer and the inner layers, and that's a serious situation for deterioration. So tapping and hearing the hollow sound, obviously this one is delaminating, but it's a way you can tell how the different layers are interacting with each other. And if it doesn't sound hollow, that particular piece of brownstone was very solid to begin with, even though sedimentary. When these rocks are quarried and cut into the headstones, there's just a naturally occurring variation in density and solidity of the rock itself. So that usually determines what's going to happen with it a few hundred years later. Anyway, we'll get him stabilized and he won't lose any more. Corey's footstone lined up with his headstone. He's somewhat loose already, needs to be straightened, maybe broken, but there might be enough of it to reset and raise up and still have it rooted in the ground properly. So first thing, carefully, because we don't damage the material with metal, away from the footstone, just carefully carve out the perimeter, removing the grass all around to free up the footstone, at least in the beginning. Then once I remove the grass and dig around him a little bit, I can take him out, see how much of it there is, and all the digging from here on is strictly with a plastic trowel so that we don't nick the stone or damage anything. So in a few minutes I'll have him trenched out and then I'll pull him out. All right, so here's the small trench dug with the plastic trowel. Grass to be put back around it and some dirt on the side to fill in. All right, so it's very loose. I'm taking it up, and there it is. Now it appears right away to not be broken. Relatively short, considering what I've seen in the past, but what I'll do is take a plastic probe stick and poke around and see if there's a base under there. But I could pretty much tell by looking at this that that's not a break of being kicked or broken over. It's the way it was made. It's just a little low, but I'm going to probe and see. Then level out the ground. Put it back in, lined up with the headstone. Put it back in pretty much exactly where it was, just potentially tilted a little bit left or right, and then leveled this way and this way with a small handheld level. Get him back in there, fill, and then with a wooden 2x4 or anything like that, tamp, fill, so it's solid. So I'll get to work on the probing part and see what we find.
Okay,
afternoon. I'm Joel Snodgrass. I'm with Steward Preservation Services, and I'm working today with the Burying Ground Preservation Group to carry out some conservation of historic burying stones in the old Sag Harbor burying ground. What you're looking at is one of the stones that we've actually re-erected and given it reinforcement because it was broken at the base. And if you look at the size of this, it's a lot of weight, and when you have a break that's towards the bottom, it's asking a lot to just provide a glue joint, quote unquote. And when I say glue, it's a term used loosely because there are lots of different adhesives that are used for different materials, different installation conditions, and so on. We're using something that's specifically designed for masonry, in this case natural stone, a thin joint outside, it's UV stable, and so on. But the point is, we have to sometimes use reinforcement, means there are pins in these stones. They're non-corrosive, they won't rust, they won't expand, or any of those types of things that are going to be detrimental to the stone. And the idea is to try to bring it back to its original form. So often it means there may be stains. You can see the darker area on the bottom of the stone. That's because it sat in the ground. So those are natural pigments from dirt. And so that'll clean up to a certain degree, but there may be always some stains there because that's just what happens with these things over time. They fall over, they get stuck back in the ground, and so on. So what we're trying to do is give it its original form back, to give it its integrity, and then subsequent to this setting up, this is, as you see, there are braces on here in all different directions to try to get the joints to all match up as best we can, and that's after we've reset the tab that's in the ground. And you'll see at the bottom, it's a very short piece. Well, don't be deceived. That's a good 3 or 4 feet down in the ground. It's almost 1/2 to 1/3 the height of this is in the ground, so there's enough stability for the stone not to fall over. Because if it was only going a short way, the weight of this alone would knock it over. So we have to reset the bottom first in the ground, which means we dig it up and we reset it carefully, and we use various materials to set it properly so it'll have drainage and so on. And then once that's done, we prepare it and we try to get it set up. Now, you'll see I'm using a structural tripod, which is really the only safe way to pick this up without preventing to get hurt, because it's a lot of weight and we need the ability to finesse it into place, which means very slow increments of moving it around, and that's why you use a power assist material. The tripod is the concept for lifting has been around for thousands of years. It's very reliable. This is a structural tripod that can carry a lot of weight, and the idea is that we use it to our best ability so that we can be careful about putting it in, and also it gives us accuracy when we're doing the work. So this is just one example, and my colleagues, as you see them in the back, are cleaning stones, and between the three of us, we're going around and trying to deal with a variety of conditions, this being one of the more dramatic because it goes from being on the ground to back up and in place. So this sometimes is the most exciting part because you see it sort of literally coming back to life and rising up, if you will. Okay, so what we're seeing is one of the stones that's getting ready to be pinned, and as you can see, there's blue masking tape. This is their typical basically non-sticky blue tape for painting, interior painting. We use it on the stones because we're trying not to put anything on the face of the stone. We're also trying not to put, say, duct tape that leaves actually a residue behind. So we're using the blue tape, and we're only using it for the period that we're marking out the conditions. So what we end up having to do is re-erect the stone by hand, hold it in place, and then once it's lined up properly, we use the tape to establish a consistent line. And then once I've cut this so when it comes apart, we now have the lines drawn so that I can put drill holes in here that will be lined up vertically when the two pieces come together. And we also measure it off so that they're set the same distance in from the same side. And that way we have the ability to make sure that the holes are lined up and not at angles, because they have to be perfectly lined up for a pin to be able to go back inside. So as I mentioned slightly earlier, we're using non-corrosive pins, stainless steel. We sometimes use plastic pins, depending on what the conditions are. When you have larger stones that are really heavy, you sometimes have to go for heavier structural reinforcement. Otherwise, the likelihood is these things will give, and you can't really rely on just an adhesive joint alone. But when we're using other stones, we'll use, as I said, various types of nylon and plastic pins for the same purpose. So this will be a slow and dirty and messy process to drill these things out. It's slow because we want to make sure the holes are very accurate. You have to start with very small drill bits and work your way up. You can't just go at it aggressively because you'll end up cracking the stone. So it's all about being careful enough to make sure we do is, try not to do any damage, and we certainly don't want to do damage while we're trying to repair. So the idea is methodical, carefully, slowly, and in a procedure that we make sure it's done the way we need to have it work so that we can make the proper repair. So this will be drilled next, and then it'll eventually get to the point of where you saw the previous stone.
Now I'm going to help with this one. All right, Zach, you've done enough. Take two. Okay, right? You're in the box.
Yep.
So we're doing this, right?
Just standing up. Right, so Zach, will.
Yes.
Just, yeah.
That's
And then we
thickness.
put another one on top. So it's above the pins.
Yeah.
Okay, we're not going to pick this up. Okay, well. Alright, so hang on. So, first of all, those boards are not helping.
No, they're not.
You can just take them out.
Tell me which way to go.
Okay, that one's in.
Okay.
One of them's pushing it forward. So I've got to adjust the whole.
I'm holding it.
Certainly lined up this way fine. It's just
Yeah.
the front to back. Morning. So what we're looking at today is the process for injection grouting, and the whole idea is that with brownstones you have a process of delamination. Think of it as a deck of cards that are coming away. The layers of the stone tend to peel back because that's how it forms horizontally, and when they extract the stone out of the ground they turn it vertically, so the planes are running in a vertical orientation even though it originally set in a horizontal orientation. The unfortunate thing is when these, and you can see the cleaves on this, whole sheets are coming off, and we're going to lose it. You lose it both on the back side, but you also, more importantly, you lose it on the front side where the carving is, the epitaph. So the idea is you can't reverse hundreds of years of action. What you can do is arrest them from going further so that you don't lose it, because this whole area, you see these dots, these are actually drill holes. There's no way to do this without providing access to the sublayer where the void is, where the separation is. You have to be able to get into it in order to fix it. So what we're trying to do is fill that void, but use a material that's designed specifically to give it some adhesion, but give it some flexibility and also give it the ability to have vapor permeability. So the moisture can go in and go out. It won't act as a block. So sometimes when glues or epoxies are used in these kinds of things, they actually prevent the moisture transfer. You get freeze thaw, it pops it, makes it even worse. So this is a specific material for the purpose, and the idea is that it's injected into the holes moving upward, and as you inject one, it'll start to show its evidence, and you cap and you move and so on and so forth. But the idea is to fill using the gravity of the liquid to find its balance as it moves up to fill this whole thing. And what we'll end up doing is doing a decorative capping on the edge of the stone to seal it and also give it some aesthetics that will try to blend in. So we're trying to go, is the philosophy on these is go with as little as you need to try to protect the stone or take it out of harm's way. And what we're really doing is trying to buy it time, because that's the ravages of moisture. They knock everything down over time. That's the nemesis of all built materials and all substances. So we're just trying to slow down the process.